Thank you, Sudi, and thank you for coming on an afternoon and adjusting to a schedule which is not typical for great decisions, but in order to get our superb speaker today, who teaches classes throughout the day, we had to make this adjustment, and we thank you for making your adjustment as well as her squeezing us in. So again, a reminder, silence these devices if you haven't already done so. On the Q&A session, you've been doing a great job asking excellent questions and keeping the questions short. Just keep that up. Just if you have a question, raise your hand and the person will get to you with the mic. Again, as Sudi indicated, we're recording this program for the James City County YouTube site, and it will go up, hopefully, before too long. And again, remind your friends who can't come to great decisions that these are wonderful resources. Also, I just want to remind you that very stimulating lunches occur with speakers, and if you're interested in one of the topics that is yet to come, just contact me or my co-coordinator, Bobby Falque, and we'd be happy to put you on our list. So next week, we turn to the relationship between the United States and the Northern Triangle. When that topic was announced, some people scratched their heads and said, what is the Northern Triangle? I'm sure all of you now have looked at that and know what the Northern Triangle is, but it's Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Obviously, very important area in relationship to issues related to refugees seeking to come to the United States and U.S. immigration policy. Our speaker will be Maria Fernanda Perez, who is the Associate Director of the Adrian Arsht Latin American Center of the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. And we'll, of course, be meeting at our regular time on Tuesday morning. Today, we're privileged to have with us Ronnie Mullin, Associate Professor of Government at William & Mary. She's been at William & Mary since 2005. She's had a number of leaves, Fulbright and other leaves that have taken her to India and other interesting parts of the globe. She did her education at the graduate level, earning MAs and PhD from an MA and a PhD from Princeton, Woodrow Wilson School, and then an MA from Johns Hopkins in Advanced International Studies. Her research and teaching at William & Mary focuses on democratization and development in South Asia, and democracy and state building in India and Afghanistan in particular. She worked prior to her coming to William & Mary at the World Bank for several years. She has served as a consultant for the U.S. Agency for International Development, and interestingly enough, was a legislative assistant to the member of the German Parliament. So it's quite a fascinating background. She, as I mentioned, spent 4 years on leave as a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, India. Her work there resulted in a very significant report issued for the Indian government. Her articles appear in such major journals as Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. And the themes that she research are also featured in her book, Decentralization, Local Governance, and Social Well-Being in India. Do Local Governments Matter? Those of us who enjoyed lunch with Ronnie before today's program know that she is extraordinarily bright, charming, and we have an excellent hour before us. Ronnie, welcome.
Thank you. All right. I don't know how to turn this off.
You don't get a home.
Okay. Does this work now?
Yeah.
No. Huh?
We don't want both mics on.
It's okay? All right. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here. Actually having me here a second time, because I did give a talk here in your series a number of years ago in Afghanistan, and I'm excited to have been asked back for a second presentation, this time on India and Pakistan. This is a really interesting part of the world to study, to better understand, and I'm teaching a course on South Asian politics at William & Mary. Actually, when I finish over here, I rush over to teach that course. And when I ask students, why are you interested in this part of the world, they tell me, well, so much is happening over there and we don't really understand it. And I've said to them, look, we know historically that the 19th century was the British century, where the sun never set on the British Empire. And the 20th century was the American century, really. And now the 21st century is being talked about as the Asian century. But I think it's worrisome that this part of the world, and South Asia in particular, I think China makes the news a little bit more frequently, but this part of the world, South Asia, does not make it to the headlines as frequently, although President Donald Trump is going to India next week. And so I think this is a good timing to try and understand, well, what's behind that visit? Why is he going? Why now? I've just got an email this morning from a journalist asking for an interview about this exact topic and trying to understand why is the administration interested in going now. He's had a standing invitation to go to India. So, why is it important to understand India and Pakistan? In trying to think about how I should structure my talk, I thought, well, why pick out India and Pakistan, and what is it about these two countries in particular in South Asia that's important to understand? And so I'm going to structure my talk around these 5 issues. I think it's important to understand India and Pakistan, their relationship in the region and geostrategically, because it's a part of the world that has had ongoing political tensions over Kashmir in particular, but in general, these two countries have fought several wars against each other. And so I think it's important to understand what that history is really all about. It's also important to understand, because these two economies, but India in particular, are rising economies. Depending on which source you look at, India is either, 5th, 6th, or 7th largest economy in the world. So important to understand, of course, it has the world's 2nd largest population, predicted to overtake China in the next 2 decades. Pakistan today, India has overtaken Pakistan in per capita GDP and the size of its economy. Pakistan is in a very precarious financial position. So I think the economy is one reason why we should look and understand this part of the world. These two countries are also nuclear powers, right? Both India and Pakistan have nuclear capacity, and they have fought several wars against each other. And while India has ruled out the possibility of being the first to strike and use nuclear weapons, Pakistan has not, right? So it's, while nuclear weapons have not been used, we do need to understand why these two have fought wars, what is the source of the tensions, and is there any way to sort of de-escalate those tensions? And then understanding India and Pakistan is also important because these two countries are located in a part of the world where, I like to start out teaching my class saying this is the least integrated region of the world, South Asia. And if it were integrated, so many more resources that could be more productively spent. But there continue to be tensions not only between India and Pakistan, but Pakistan and Afghanistan, India and Nepal, India and Sri Lanka, etc. So important to understand what's happening in the region and what are some of the sources of tensions, what are some of the new sources of tension. Over lunch we were talking about environmental degradation and control of waters. I firmly believe that, issues such as access to clean water, we're going to see wars being fought over that in this century. So important to understand how these countries play out sort of regionally, what are the roles they play in terms of contributing towards regional stability. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the larger geostrategic implications for countries like India and Pakistan. It's not only the wars they have fought against each other and the continuing sources of tension, but it's also China, in the neighborhood, and they both have very different relationships with China and different relationships with the United States. So I'll wrap up talking about that. All right, so let me first turn to the issue of trying to understand why these two countries have fought wars, why there are these enduring political tensions. And let me just start out by saying a little bit about the recent elections in both these countries over the last 2 years. So Prime Minister Modi, I have that photo here of him after his election last year, won with a huge majority, He had 353 seats out of 545 seats in the lower house of the parliament. And so he sweeps the lower house, gets a larger majority, and the largest majority in 30 years. India is now essentially a two-party system. The Congress Party dominated for decades after Indian independence. And it had that mantle of legitimacy because they had delivered independence for India. But over the last couple of decades, we've seen a rise of the last 3 decades. We've seen the hold on power that the Congress Party had disintegrating, and now a situation where the two main political parties are the Congress Party and BJP, which is the party of Prime Minister Modi. And in the last 2 elections, Modi has won with huge majorities, And I think there's been quite a bit of introspection about where's the Congress Party heading, because it was ruled by Prime Minister Nehru, India's first prime minister, then ruled by his daughter, Indira Gandhi, no relationship with Mahatma Gandhi, and then her sons. And now we have the 4th generation with Nehru's great-grandson leading the Congress Party. But India that has changed over these last 70 years. India where, dynasty is no longer your clear ticket to being elected. And so really what we've witnessed is the demise of the Congress Party in a two-party system. That means that the other party has risen, as the Congress Party has fallen. And so these elections really solidified BJP's hold on power, Modi's in particular, and this has been an interesting development for several reasons. These last elections, so when he won in 2014, when he first came to power, he won on the promise of clean government, anti-corruption, delivering higher economic growth rates, and people voted for him. And there was a sense that that's what people voted for. They wanted to see their rivers cleaned up, they were fed up with the corruption scandals, and they wanted to make sure that, in the aftermath of the 2008 global economic crisis, that India was going to get on path to high economic growth rates again. He did not deliver on those promises. And yet he won with a greater majority. How do we understand that win, right? How do you win when you don't really deliver on your election promises? In fact, in the run-up to the elections, in the run-up to the 2019 elections, the BJP was ousted from 3 Indian states. So state elections preceding the national elections, they were ousted. So it wasn't looking great. They had a majority in most of the states, but the sort of, the political pundits were saying, well, what does this mean for the BJP? Elections were in May of last year, and then in February of last year, Indian security forces were attacked in Pulwama, Kashmir. 40 were killed. The Pakistani-based terrorist organization JEM, or Jaish-e-Mohammed, claimed responsibility. And there is some intelligence evidence that the Pakistani state might have been involved in that. Pakistan denied it, but after this, the Indian government sent 12 Indian Air Force jets across the line of control in Kashmir. I'll have a map up later on. And they dropped bombs in Balakot. Now that was the Indian story, claiming that they had targeted JEM terrorist camp. Pakistan said they intercepted these Indian jets that had, for the first time, actually crossed the line of control in Kashmir, and that in a hurry to get back to Indian territory, the jets just let go of their cargo, and that it didn't actually do anything, right, that they returned. Then subsequent to that, there was a dogfight between Indian and Pakistani jet fighters, and an Indian MiG was downed, and the pilot ejected. Pakistan captured the pilot and kept him for a couple days and then returned him. So, all of this played out in the lead up to the elections. And there's not a doubt in my mind that it influenced the election outcomes. So that in terms of why was Modi able to deliver, increase his sort of election results without delivering on his prior electoral promises, and it was due to all this sort of nationalist coverage that he got and his party got in the aftermath of the Pulwama attacks. Now, since those elections, since coming back to power, the Modi government has turned even more Hindu nationalist and has redefined Indian citizenship along even more exclusive and Hindu nationalist terms. And so I think the larger question about India today is, will democratic India allow the tearing apart of its secular fabric? The world's largest democracy in the world, right? India, with a population of 1.3 billion, is that secular fabric on which its democracy, 70-year-old democracy, has existed, will that endure? On the one hand, and let me just say there are indications on both sides to argue this. On the one hand, the Indian Supreme Court in November of last year handed down a verdict on the Ayodhya issue. And Ayodhya was in the town of Ayodhya, there was a Muslim temple, 500-year-old Muslim temple that stood there, and in the early 90s, Hindu nationalist extremists tore down that mosque, saying that was the birthplace of a Hindu god. And in November 2019, the Indian Supreme Court, which Modi has been able to staff with a couple of Supreme Court judges, handed down a decision that allows a building of a Hindu temple on that ground where the 500-year-old mosque was torn down. So, if you look at that, right, it would give you pause about where the institutions are, Indian democratic institutions are going. On the other hand, Delhi, the capital, which has its own voting elections, recently, just 10 days ago or so, had elections, and BJP heavily campaigned there, but the AAP party, the Aam Aadmi Party, which translates as Common Man's Party, so this is a political party that really was saying, you know, we've got to start focusing on providing shelters for Delhi's homeless, for providing access to education and healthcare, etc. They won 62 out of the 70 seats, right, in the last election. So that gives me some hope that Indian democracy is still functioning and very much vibrant, and the BJP, which only won 8 out of those 70 seats, has some explaining to do and has to reorient its anti-Muslim, its Hindu nationalist rhetoric, because in the end, India has had elections since 1951, and the electorate is pretty savvy in terms of, they might not all be literate, but they're pretty savvy in knowing how and what they're voting for. Okay, let me turn to Pakistan, which had elections 2 years ago, year and a half ago. And those elections brought Imran Khan, who's right there, former cricketer, won his party, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, wins against the two really. Pakistan has also its own dynasties, and these two political parties that have jostled for power when they have had democratic elections. And so a new party that came to power under Imran Khan. It's the third consecutive transfer of power in Pakistan. So in political theory, we talk about sort of the double turnover test, which means if you have peaceful turnover of power twice through the ballot box rather than through guns, then that says something about that democracy might be taking root in the country. So the third turnover of transfer of power in Pakistan. But there are some worries, especially because according to some research, there has been clamping down on media since Imran Khan's new party has come to power, indifference of the judiciary, and the continued role of the Pakistani military in determining political decisions really made by the government. Okay, I'm seeing that I have to speed up a little bit to make sure I cover everything that I wanted to cover. So Kashmir. This is just to catch you up on what has happened recently. So there are two issues, two laws that Modi's government, since coming to power, since being re-elected, I should say, last year, has had a much more Hindu nationalist agenda. And that was in their party platform, so it was clear that this is what they campaigned on, right? Sort of a state that would be driven by majority, the majority group, the Hindus. And so we have seen two big issues that the government has become involved in, has passed. The first one that I have up there is Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. And this is essentially an article which gave some autonomy to Kashmir, right? Indian administrated Kashmir. And this has been part of India's constitution from the beginning. And Modi said, look, this gave Kashmir significant autonomy, and it has also been a barrier to the development of Kashmir, and we need to integrate Kashmir and make it like any other state. And so essentially, they've abrogated, that was one of the first acts that they passed when they came back to power, was abrogating Article 370. Another issue that they've gotten involved in is the Citizenship Amendment Act, which is, a amendment to the Constitution that was passed in December of last year. And it essentially is saying that citizens from the neighboring countries of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh who came to India before December 2014 and who were not Muslims. So they could be Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, Jain, Parsis, etc., but not Muslim, would be fast-tracked for citizenship, for Indian citizenship. And when there was outcry, you know, why are you leaving the Muslims out? They were saying, well, you know, these other countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, are Muslim-majority countries. So the whole point of accepting and fast-tracking citizens, refugees from these countries, is that these are persecuted minorities in these countries, and these countries are Muslim-majority countries, and therefore they can't be persecuted in these countries. But the Indian Constitution says that India is, quote, a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic, right? So the secular fabric is clear then in India's constitution. Think about what this means in terms of the Indian government starting to use religion as a criteria for citizenship, right? It's a slippery slope. It's the first time India has incorporated religious criteria into its naturalization or refugee policy, and important because India does have the world's second largest Muslim population. So, in effect, when these two countries were born, Pakistan was created as a homeland for South Asia's Muslims, and India was a secular country where all were welcome. That was the idea. But by going and changing the idea of who is Indian and who is not, who has access to Indian citizenship and who's not, what is happening is essentially the so-called two-nation theory that the founders of Pakistan were saying, well, we're essentially two different nations, a Hindu nation and Muslim nation, and we need to create a homeland for South Asia's Muslims. And the founders of India had very different ideas. They said, no, we're secular India, we're a union of India, and there was no mention of homeland for Hindus or anything of that sort. But essentially, by taking these steps, they're actually starting to confirm those ideas that led to the creation of Pakistan. This two-nation theory that Hindus and Muslims of South Asia have different homelands in different countries. This Citizenship Amendment Act is now at the Indian Supreme Court. It has passed the Indian Parliament, but Indian Supreme Court will take a while so we can't really expect a decision on that anytime soon. But these articles have been passed, and I think in order to understand this, let me just go back a little bit further in history. And this is a map of India and Pakistan in 1947, when British India gained its independence and was subdivided into two countries. Because really, to understand the Kashmir problem, you have to go back to 1947. And as this map here shows, you had India that was created in orange here, and this entire colored entity was British India. In 1947, They chopped off the two areas that had Muslim majorities, what became East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, and West Pakistan, to create Pakistan and India. But the problem was these areas here in gray, because these were, and there were some others, but these were essentially princely estates. India had several hundred of them, British India. And in theory, these princely estates were supposed to be able to decide which country they were going to be able to join or wanted to join, right? Now you can see why Hyderabad, right, ruled by a Muslim ruler, though the majority of the population was Hindu, why India was less than keen on letting Hyderabad join Pakistan, right? Essentially, they didn't want this checkerboard country, didn't want to end up with that. But you can see how Hyderabad, right, Pakistan might have taken a different tack on Hyderabad versus Kashmir. So Kashmir, a Muslim majority region of British India, and yet it was a territory, a principality that was ruled by a Hindu Maharaja, right, Hari Singh. And so what happens here? How do we understand? How do we understand partition? Because this is one of the largest movements of refugees in history. Millions, 10 to 12 million people moved from what became Pakistan to India and what became India to Pakistan based on their religious background. 2 million people were killed, right? Sort of this communal carnage. And so really a difficult situation, really a horrific situation. But you have to understand Kashmir in that context, because it is really what, understanding this will help you understand why this is still a festering sore in South Asian relations. So, lingering questions about this entity of Kashmir. The area was contested already before partition, but under the partition plan as drawn up by the British, Kashmir was free to accede to either Pakistan or India. But the ruler dithered, right? He was worried. Here he was a Hindu, but he was governing an area that was majority Muslim. And so he was worried. He wasn't quite sure what he should do. So he didn't decide. And then in October, so just a couple months after partition, by the way, partition and where that boundary actually wasn't decided, wasn't announced until 3 days after independence, right? So you have millions traveling, carnage, and they don't even know where the exact border is. Just a horrific situation. But anyway, so 2 months, it's October, gets cold in the mountains of Kashmir during this time, and the Maharaja thinks maybe he wants to actually have independence for Kashmir, and then Pakistan sends these Pashtun guerrillas over the border, tribesmen, right, that come across from Pakistan into Kashmir. And so he then calls up Delhi and says, you got to help me out, send troops to help push back these tribesmen. And India said, you haven't acceded to the Union of India, we can't send troops. And so he signs the instrument of accession. India sends in troops, they're able to push back, so a year-long, a little bit over a year, the war, and there is then a demarcation of, so you see this is all of Kashmir, and India essentially ends up with 2/3 of Kashmir and Pakistan with about 1/3 of that region. That's not all, because we also, in addition to this is the line of control between, I think you have quite a good map actually in the article, the Great Expectations article, but there's then also this disputed area India fought a war against China in 1962. Chinese took this part of Kashmir, and then Pakistan ceded part of Kashmir to China. And so you can see it's kind of a mess in terms of this entire entity, right? Kashmir, with both India and Pakistan still claiming that they are the rightful sort of government to control this area, and then you throw China into the mix, and you have the makings of 3 wars that have been fought, or 2 formal wars. 3 wars between India and Pakistan. The 1971 was over East Pakistan, which then becomes Bangladesh. So let me just mention, after 1947, India and Pakistan also fight a war in 1965 against each other. Pakistan tries to infiltrate forces across the line of control and precipitate an insurgency against Indian rule. India retaliates with full-scale military attack on Pakistan, gaining the upper hand, and then the Soviet Union and the US intervene and bring about a ceasefire that leads to the Tashkent Declaration and the line of control being reaffirmed. 1971, India and Pakistan fight a war against each other, but that's not a war about Kashmir. That was had to do with East Pakistan declaring independence from West Pakistan. 10 million refugees come over from East Pakistan, what becomes Bangladesh, over into India. And India at that point was struggling, clearly started intervening also in Bangladesh's liberation movement. But it's Pakistan that formally crosses the border, starts that fighting, and after 2 weeks, Pakistani forces surrendered to a joint command of Indian and Bangladeshi forces. That was 1971, and Bangladesh was created. And then in the 1990s, there was an insurgency in Kashmir and sort of a low-grade war that your chapter and article also talks about. Okay, so you can see it's a difficult issue, but the issue of Kashmir dates back to 1947. Okay, I'm going to race through in the next 7 minutes or so the other issues that I wanted to highlight. Where are these economies? So in the 1980s, when I was starting to learn a little bit about South Asia, it was the case that Pakistan was better off than India. In per capita terms, economy was doing better growth rates, etc. Those roles have reversed today, right? The Indian economy is 5th or 7th large, somewhere along, this is the newest rankings show India to have overtaken France as well as its former colonizer, the UK. But, right, so the economy overall is growing, so in large GDP terms, it ranks as one of the top 10 economies in the world, but for a 3rd year in a row, economic growth rates have been weak. From, when Modi first came to power, it was around 8%, and now they're revising it downward to about 5% for this fiscal year. So Modi has just come out with a new budget. He has all kinds of social programs that he's stimulus, right, to try and bring about greater investments, spending on infrastructure, farming, and some social benefits. 15 billion that they've earmarked for this. But the government has to raise 30 billion because the economy has not been doing well. And much of this has to come from the sale of state-owned enterprises. Unlikely that they're going to meet that fiscal target. And so this question of how long will democratic India continue to elect Modi and his party, the BJP, when they failed to deliver on the economic front. Pakistan, let me just say, essentially, Pakistan is broke. It's flat out broke. It's, you know, it has this history. It's gone 13 times to the IMF for a bailout. It's gotten bailout. Then it cobbles together. But fundamentally, it's a really unequal society. Elites that park their money in Switzerland and other places. Don't want to single out Switzerland, but an elite that has essentially, and a military-industrial complex that has not been able to ensure broad-based growth, right? So the economy is a mess. They've taken out loans, and one of the countries that they're quite indebted to is China, right? So, this $60+ billion CPEC project, part of the Belt and Road project of China, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is what CPEC stands for, which is supposed to connect Gwadar Port over here on the Arabian coast through railroads and roads to China's Xinjiang province in the west, right? And some of you might have heard about Xinjiang, where there are internment camps for Chinese Muslims in that area. So, trying to connect with all kinds of infrastructure projects. Pakistan government has given Gwadar Port to China on a 40-year lease agreement. This question of loans, because China never gives foreign aid in the form of grants, it only does loans. And loans have to be paid back. And you know, you take loans out for financially sustainable projects, and you've got to make some money in order to pay those loans off. But what happens when you don't make money? Right, you become more and more indebted. And so huge concerns about debt equity swaps. I don't know if any of you heard that term, but it's becoming a sort of boogeyman in Asia in particular. It's not quite clear you know, what Pakistan is going to do if they can't pay back these loans to China. They are in a position where many of these infrastructure investments have not been, you know, money-making, such as Gwadar Port, such as some of the roads that have been built. Some of their energy investments are doing okay, but not all of them. And yet, you know, for political reasons, China is their all-weather friend, as they say, right? So they have these big loans they're taking off. Much of the infrastructure is being built with Chinese labor, so it's not clear that the local government's local population benefits. And this question of sovereignty and actual risks. Okay, I'll try and do the last couple slides very quickly. So, can I have a little bit more time? Okay, great. All right, so then there's the nuclear power question, right? Both are nuclear powers, both have the capacity, the capabilities to strike each other's territory and cause huge damage. India has a no first use policy, Pakistan does not. And, you know, when we look at the history of their nuclear power, India lost the 1962 war against China. And it was in the aftermath of that, and its first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, dies in 1964. And so these two events really push India to start seeking nuclear power as a way of sort of balancing its felt weakness vis-a-vis China, right? And of course, because India was going and down that path of acquiring nuclear weapons, but particularly after what was for Pakistan a humiliating loss of 1971 war, having to surrender to India and Bangladesh, because think about the very idea of creating a country for South Asia's Muslims, right? Divided into West and East Pakistan. But what does it do to that very idea when half your territory and the more populous half say, we don't want anything to do with you, we want our independence, right? So the very idea of Pakistan is then challenged. When the second partition of the subcontinent happens in 1971, and there are some great books that have come out in the last few years about this. One that makes for fascinating reading is by a friend at Princeton, and it's called The Blood Telegram. So if any of you are interested in that whole genocide that happens in Bangladesh and the whole war, and he wrote this because the Kissinger-Nixon White House discussions were just declassified, and so he had access to them, and so he tells that whole story and the crucial role that Pakistan was playing in 1971 to help Nixon reach out to China. And so we were just not interested in helping India in any way, and we let Indira Gandhi sit in the hallways of the White House for an hour, and Nixon and Kissinger repeatedly called her the bitch. So, you know, there were all kinds of issues there that led to tensions. And it's in the aftermath of India going to the US, begging for money to deal with the 10 million refugees that it had from East Pakistan, that India then goes to the Soviet Union, and India and Soviet Union signed the Indo-Soviet Friendship Treaty, and that leads to India acquiring most of its military hardware in those subsequent decades from the Soviet Union and later Russia, though they're changing that, and the US is actively engaged in selling hardware to India. Okay, so to think about, you know, this humiliating loss, Pakistan then moves towards acquiring nuclear weapons, and just the rogue element that can present in both countries, gaining control of nuclear weapons, particularly in Pakistan. There have been studies of selling of nuclear technology to other countries, including North Korea. Okay, so we should also, zooming out beyond sort of India and Pakistan, let me just mention a couple countries here. Why should we care about these two countries? Well, we should care about them because they and their larger region will have an impact on regional stability, right? So when we look at what has been happening in Sri Lanka, China has invested heavily in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka, of course, is very close to India, and so Indians are quite worried about sort of Chinese encroachment in what they see as their backwaters. In Afghanistan, you all probably know that the US is in discussions with the Taliban on a peace agreement that's very, very likely. I think there's no question in almost anyone's mind that once this peace agreement is signed, the Taliban is going to come back to power. Why does this matter for countries such as India and Pakistan? Well, Pakistan has a long history of funding, of being actively involved in channeling funds. During the 1980s, when we were fighting the Soviet Union over in Afghanistan, we channeled money to the anti-Soviet forces through the Pakistani military. Since then, the Pakistani military has had active links, and if any of you are interested in reading up about those engagements of Pakistan, Carlotta Gall's book, The Wrong Enemy, and Stephen Cole's book on Directorate S are great works to read. They kind of read like thrillers, especially Cole's book. Okay, so a worry that instability in Afghanistan will have a domino effect in the region. And let me just mention, why is this important to India? Because India obviously doesn't share a direct border with Afghanistan, and yet they're quite worried because in December of 1999, an Indian Airlines plane going from Kathmandu, Nepal to Delhi was hijacked, and the plane ended up landing in Kandahar in Afghanistan. The Taliban ended up negotiating, as it turned out, in collaboration with Pakistan's military intelligence, and they essentially eventually secured the release of all passengers on board of that airline in exchange for Islamist radicals being held in Indian prisons. So those Islamists were released to Pakistan in exchange for the passengers being let go. One of those people who was released was implicated in the 2002 killing of the New York Times journalist Daniel Pearl. And another was implicated in the 2008 Mumbai attacks, India's equivalent of 9/11. And so for India, the 1990s, when the Taliban ruled Afghanistan, was a time of great political instability in the region, not only because of the impact it had vis-a-vis its relationship with Pakistan, but also because at that time, when the Taliban government was at its height of power, right, in the late 1990s, it was also the same time when you had an insurgency in Kashmir. And according to Indians, those two are not coincidental, right? Essentially, they argue, when I talk to Indian analysts, they say, you know, what Pakistan did was, now that their western border was secure, they just shifted resources to their eastern border in Kashmir. Okay, so I can talk about Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and others if you would like me to in the Q&A. I would just like to spend a couple words on geostrategic importance of this region. I spent the last 2 years in Singapore and looking at sort of South Asia from an East Asian or Southeast Asian lens. And what is really interesting is that you really feel in East Asia the importance of China and how that is really tying the hands of many countries. And here's a map I had put together a couple years ago on Chinese and Indian investments in ports, because you know, in order to understand what is going on, let me just move to another map here, so you can see from Darwin, Australia, to Brunei, to Myanmar, to Hambantota and Sri Lanka, Maldives, Pakistan, right, Djibouti, basically down the East African coast. The Chinese government or state-owned enterprises have been buying up ports. They've been buying them up, largely getting them under 99-year lease agreements. And 99 years is an awfully long time, you know. That's 99 years is what the British had Hong Kong for. So, so to think about what that means, right, when you have Hambantota port. So what happened in Hambantota, and this is, I'll end on this to just get you to see why Indians and other countries in the neighborhood are worried about massive Chinese investments. So China helped Sri Lanka end its two-decade-old civil war by giving it significant military hardware. And by all accounts, the civil war and how the government ended it, it was quite brutal, right? All kinds of issues of human rights violations, etc. And Sri Lanka was a little bit of a pariah in the aftermath of that. The US wanted India and others to push on this human rights record. And Sri Lanka needed money to rebuild after this civil war. And the ones who were ready to lend, China, right? And so China said, well, we'll go ahead and build and, you know, build up roads, railroads, ports, including Hambantota Port, which is located right here in the southern tip of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka took over $1 billion out in loans for it and agreed, despite World Bank and others having done feasibility studies and saying this is not a financially viable investment. Sri Lankan government went ahead, borrowed, port was built, no ship stocked, no money to pay back. What do? You know, you're in a debt trap. And what they ended up doing was what's become known as a debt equity swap. So they traded their debt to China for a 99-year lease agreement of the port and 15,000 acres of adjacent land for a state-owned enterprise. The Chinese also are building right next to the capital of Colombo. They're building a Colombo city, which they've created land by dredging up land, right? Just like the islands that they've created in the South China Sea. And they're going to they're going to put in $10 billion of investment. And this is also land, reclaimed land, but land on a 99-year lease. A city that the Chinese say they're building to rival Hong Kong as well as Singapore. So you can see, right, it brings up issues of sovereignty, of issues of development path and how to go along with that. And this is not only an issue in the Indian Ocean, it's an issue in Pacific Islands and beyond. And India in particular is starting to feel encircled by Chinese investments, while Pakistan has a good relationship with China and say, well, these are our all-weather friends. And I've asked former Pakistani ambassadors, well, what do you do if you can't pay back those loans you're taking out from China? And they said, we're too big to fail. Perhaps. Okay, with that, I'll end, and happy to discuss. I'll just leave this last slide up because I think that's sort of a question mark. How does this work? Are there any questions? Do you take them to?
During the migration of 1948, were there different socioeconomic groups that went to East Pakistan as opposed to West? Because I remember in the very beginning of the split, before Bangladesh came into its own, Bangladesh was viewed as so incredibly poor, with no resources. So I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Thank you. That's an interesting question because I can go back to that slide, but the migration across borders was much less on the eastern side than it was on the western side. So the movement was much greater towards West Pakistan. I don't know where I have that slide. Here, right? So these movements here were much greater than these movements here. You can see that by the arrows there. And in terms of socioeconomic differences, I would say, you had the Maharaja or the Nizam of Hyderabad, right, that state down here, leave on an airplane with his entourage of dogs and jewelry. He used to be one of the richest men in the world. He left by airplane, others left on carts and on foot. So you saw the difference in how they traveled by different economic class, but really it tore families apart. A former student of mine from here at William and Mary, I went to his brother's wedding, and his grandfather was one of 7 men. He had 6 brothers, and 6 of them went to Pakistan, and his grandfather stayed back in India. So it just tore families apart in terms of who went and who didn't. I have not seen analysis by income breakdown, but certainly there's enough evidence that it was across the board in terms of class. Now, in terms of why was there less movement over here compared to over here? and I don't have a great answer for that, but one is that Bengal has a common language, it has a common cultural identity, and what became West Pakistan here was you had Pashtuns in this area, you had Baluch who had wanted their own state, you had Punjabis over here and Sinds over here, so it was much more mixed baggage there than you had on the other side.
To what extent did the recent drubbing that Modi's party took in...
Sorry, I can't see. Where's the question? Ah, okay.
To what extent did the drubbing that Modi's party just took in the New Delhi elections reflect pushback against the Muslim exclusion law on the part of people who believe in a secular India? And to what extent was it due to something else?
Yeah, I think unfortunately it was more all politics are local, right, when it comes to local political elections. So in this case, the Aam Aadmi Party had been in power before, but they had lost quite a few. So in the national level elections, the number of candidates that India sends to parliament representation, BJP had done quite well last year in those elections. Why did it play out differently? I think the Aam Aadmi Party has actually delivered on the ground in terms of access to water, healthcare, etc. I wish it were about, the secular fabric of India. There have been ongoing protests in parts of Delhi. So there's one Muslim neighborhood where only women have been protesting every day since this abrogation of Kashmir's autonomy law was announced. And so I think that there's awareness of these issues that surely played some part, but it was probably, unfortunately, not the main issue driving this. But I do think in the end, you have to deliver, right? You might be elected once or twice. So I ask cab drivers, have you voted? Why did you vote for him? And they said, well, once wasn't really enough. Maybe it was too short a time. We want him to, and we think he's best placed to turn the economy around. But if he doesn't deliver this time, we're going to look elsewhere, hopefully. Yes.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
Given that long history of Chinese support for India, and now given the current situation,
For Pakistan?
No, support for India, China's support for India and all the military hardware from China?
It's largely
I'm
from
sorry,
Russia.
that was from Russia.
Yeah,
From Russia.
Soviet Union, yeah.
But given that, how do you view the U.S. Future support in India and the interrelationship?
So the U.S. has been selling an awful lot of hardware in the last decade, right? It's become, I think, the largest deliverer. India has been making sure it doesn't just source from the U.S. because they're worried because U.S. supplies to Pakistan also, so they don't want to be on the same jets that can be scrambled with the same technology, et cetera. That's what I'm told. But they've been on a buying spree this past decade, and a lot of their hardware is increasingly sourced from military hardware from the U.S., which the Russians have not been very happy with.
I hadn't thought about the Indian caste system since high school, probably.
Oh.
And so I was very interested in our readings to see several references to the caste system. And I wonder if you could talk about where is that going, especially under Modi? How is that playing into politics? I had assumed it was just withering away, but perhaps not.
Yes, that's an interesting question because the founding fathers of India and the writers of the Constitution struggled with this. How do you make caste less relevant? Do you do that by safeguarding those at the bottom end and giving them access to jobs, etc., right, having a quota system, or do you hope that it'll go away by not mentioning it at all? And so over the past decades, what India has done is actually put affirmative action type policies in place for accessing government jobs, for accessing university slots to be able to study at university. Has that increased caste awareness? I mean, a discussion on caste could take up hours, right? Because it's a complex matter. But what we have seen is essentially, I think, if you look at the Indian economy and try and look at, who owned what and what kind of class system was in place, India was governed by, there was a small elite layer at the top, and then the vast majority of people were poor. There was really not much of a middle class in the 70s and even in the 80s. But really what you've had since the economic reform of the early 1990s is a growth of a middle class that varies from 200 million to 300 million, somewhere thereabouts, right? Huge purchasing power, people who are, right, going out and shopping and who now want to ensure that their kids have those same opportunities, can go to universities that educate them in English, that so they become computer literate, etc. Many of those are from lower classes, that new middle class. And there has been sort of pushback and disenchantment with the way the elites have governed, right? And there's much overlap between the elites and the top of the caste system. So Nehru to his great-grandson, who's the head of the Congress Party, are Brahmins, the top of the caste system. So I think while boundaries have become more fluid, it is the case that, people look at what your qualifications are in order to get a job, where you have to speak English and have to have a computer, be computer literate, right? But Indians can also tell by your last name, where you're from, etc. They can figure out pretty quickly what your caste background is. And so I'm not saying it's no longer relevant, especially because there is incentive to mobilize along caste lines to get access to jobs, and it's really difficult to get into the top Indian universities. Every year at the time of admissions, there are stories about, my kid can get into the Ivies in the US, but it can't get into the St. Stephen's or whatever, the top universities in India, because it's just, there just are so few good universities with spaces. And some of those are reserved, so there's great competition, and competition that gets people to mobilize along caste lines. So while I think overall the salience of caste and getting access to jobs in the private sector, right, has gone down, it's still there because accessing government jobs and accessing education slots, you have to, and even some social programs, you have to have a particular caste background. Any other questions?
Could you say a word, or do you have a question?
You mentioned briefly this new domino theory about that might occur if the Taliban were to come back in control in Afghanistan. What is the theory on what those dominoes are and how they might fall?
Well, this is what I've heard from some Indian strategic people in the sort of strategic thinking space. India's own history, where under Taliban-ruled Afghanistan, Pakistan had a close relationship with that government, and it led Pakistan to be comfortable about its western border, and from the Indian perspective, create greater havoc on its eastern border with India. So India worries that a return of the Taliban in Afghanistan, and crucial, again, to delivering that peace, by the way, is Pakistan, right? Pakistan and our relationship in the US with Pakistan President Trump came to office and in 2017 laid out a South Asia policy that was quite critical of Pakistan and said, we're going to hold them to what they're actually delivering for us. Now, when he sees how important Pakistan is to delivering the Taliban, including Taliban members who live in Pakistan, who the government has links with, that relationship will enable Pakistan to again play a dominant role in the government of Afghanistan. And that will lead it to again wreak havoc, according to Indians, in Kashmir. And that will then again bring about a difficult situation in Kashmir where the insurgency gets reinvigorated. Now, of course, the insurgency will take off because of this Article 370, right? There's the Indian government cracked down, and for a while there was no access to phones, to internet, etc. And there's still a crackdown in Kashmir. And all indications are that once all of that is lifted, people will start rallying against this. But there's, from the Indian government's perspective, Pakistan is much more likely, if a Taliban government is in power in Kabul, to raise problems in Kashmir. And, it might not end there, right? They're worried about what does that mean in terms of the rise of extremist Islamists in India, in Bangladesh, etc.
I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to ask it.
Okay.
So what can we expect from a visit of Donald J. Trump, President, to India? Does this mean anything significant in terms of U.S.-Indian policy and the implications for the region?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that these last few hours to try and figure out why now, because Modi gave, President Trump had Modi visiting here in the United States, and India issued an open invitation to President Trump. Why has he decided now to go to India, right? And not last year or last month. I think there's several factors. I think he knows that India is quite worried about what this potential peace deal in Afghanistan might mean. And the fact that the U.S. has been cooperating more closely again with Pakistan in order to bring about this peace deal has not made the Indians very happy. So there's one issue in terms of sort of placating the Indians. But I don't think President Trump is one about, worrying about what others think. I think for him it's his bottom line. And the Indian economy, even though growth has slowed down, is still a huge economy. It's really important. And also in geostrategic terms, if we're interested in any way, I don't want to use the word containment, but engaging in a way where countries that have borrowed from China are in a corner, have more options, I think it's in the U.S. interest to get India more involved in the region. So I think his visit is going to be driven by economics. That business sense tends to be a driving force of his visits, but I also think that the larger geostrategic picture there is undoubtedly part of what's motivating him to go.
Thank you very much, Professor Mullin. Thank you for coming.